Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today I want to take a look at which team was the furthest away from survival in each of Europe's top 15 leagues. What I mean by that basically is what was the biggest gap between last place and the lowest placed team who survived in that particular season. So for example, in the Premier League, what was the biggest gap between 20th place and 17th place? If that doesn't make any sense through that, I'm sure it'll make more sense as the video goes on. In the past, I've done videos looking at the biggest gap between the title winners of a particular league and second place, and the closest gap as well. So if you want to check those videos out, there'll be links to them at the end screen of this video. And whilst you're there, of course, please don't forget, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But without any further ado, let's have a look at the furthest distance between last place and survival in each of Europe's top 15 leagues during the 3 points for a win era. That's a very important distinction. I'm not going all the way back to the start of each of those leagues because that would take me forever. Eliteserien, Sandefjord, 22 points. Going from 15th in the current coefficient rankings means we start off with Norway's Eliteserien, although we're covering a season when it was known as the Tippeligaen. The team we are focusing on for this segment is Sandefjord, a relatively young team having only been founded in 1998, although they were able to rise up through the divisions to reach the top flight by 2006, a year they also finished as Norwegian Cup runners-up. However, following a relegation the year afterwards, they bounced back straight away and looked to have consolidated by finishing comfortably in mid-table in 2009. How wrong that proved to be. In 2010, they went through a season from hell, only managing to win 2 games all year and accruing 12 points while scoring just 25 goals, with 12 of them coming across 3 games, albeit one of them was a shock 6-1 trouncing of Hønefoss. Hønefoss would actually end up being relegated through the relegation playoffs, meaning that we are calculating Sandefjord's points total in comparison to 13th place Brann, who got 34 points, and the subsequent gap of 22 is the highest in Norwegian football history since the 3 points for a win system came into being. Ukrainian Premier League, Zorya Luhansk, 24 points. Despite Zirka Kirovohrad failing to win a single game in 1999-2000 and finishing the campaign on a meagre 9 points, they were still 20 points away from safety, which is, quite remarkably, 4 fewer than the Ukrainian record. Admittedly, Kirovohrad only played 30 games compared to record holder Zorya Luhansk's tally of 34, so if they had played those extra 4 games, I have no doubt they would be the team to feature. But instead, Luhansk get the nod, or whatever the opposite to get the nod is when applied to this context. Nowadays, Zorya are probably the best team in Ukraine outside of the traditional Big Two, having qualified for Europe for 10 consecutive seasons and finished 3rd in 3 out of the last 5 campaigns. That wasn't always the case though, as they were languishing in the 3rd tier of Soviet football upon the USSR's dissolution in 1991, and that lowly status translated over to independent Ukrainian football when they were embroiled in the start of the Ukrainian Premier League's era in multiple relegation battles. They finally succumbed to what had seemed an inevitable fate in 1996, although they did so in stunning fashion as they ended the season on 16 points, 4 wins and 16 goals scored across their 34 matches, with 26 losses to their name. 24 points was the gap between them and Naiva Vinnytsaya, who had survived the drop on 40 points. But somehow things would get even worse for Zorya as they were relegated to the 3rd tier in 1998, where they would spend 5 years before finally making strides back up the pyramid. Super League, MK Ankaragucu, 28 points. Officially, the record holder should be Ankaraspor, who were banned in October 2009 by the Turkish Football Federation owing to their relationship with MK Ankaragucu being deemed to be against the rules and damaging the integrity of Turkish football. So they forfeited all their games 3-0 and were subsequently 34 points from safety, as the lowest placed team to survive got 34 points. However, that's on a technicality, so I decided to ignore it, although coincidentally, the team who actually hold the record is MK Ankaragucu, which they set 2 years on from when their supposed affiliate team were banned from the top flight. Ankaragucu had been a mid-table side for the previous few seasons, although their financial plight, which had already been in a perilous state, was getting worse and worse by the year. It was revealed that 11 players hadn't been paid their wages in full, and they were 55 million Turkish lira in debt, which isn't a particularly good omen leading into a campaign. Those omens turned out to be prescient, as after 10 more players were released midway through the season, leaving them with an extremely depleted squad, they ended the campaign on just 2 wins, 27 losses 77 goals conceded, and 11 points in total, some 28 points shy of 15th place Antalyaspor's tally of 39. What's more, they were relegated again, this time to the third tier, in 2012-13, and it would take another 5 years before they were back in the Super League once more. Serbian Superliga, Bačka, 32 points. Now, I was quite surprised to find out that in 2010-11, Ćućalički achieved what may well be an all-time low in any top flight league by any team of 5 points across the campaign. But somehow, they weren't as far away from survival as Bačka were in 2020-21. And it's not even close. Ćućalički were 8 wins, so 24 points, away from an unlikely survival act, albeit they didn't win a single game all season, so it definitely wasn't going to happen. But Bačka was so far cut adrift at the foot of the table that even if they'd won 10 more games than their actual tally of 3 from 38, they still wouldn't have been able to beat the drop. Admittedly, there is an ever so slight caveat to this, as owing to COVID-19 blighting the 2019-20 season, the Serbian FA decided not to enforce relegation that year, but keep promotion from the second tier in place. So 4 teams went up from the Serbian First League to make the Serbian Superliga a 20-team league for the 2020-21 campaign, with one of those promoted teams being Bačka. This meant that, instead of 2 teams guaranteed to be relegated each year with the potential for a third through the playoffs, 6 teams would suffer that ignominious fate in order for the league to return to its regular format of 16 teams. Bačka were the worst of them by far, as they were 32 points behind 14th place Voždovac when the season drew to a close. And even though they are realistically here because of the fact that over the course of the league would be relegated that year, it is still a record, so it has to feature. Swiss Super League, Lausanne Sport, 18 points. The first tie in this video comes courtesy of the Swiss Super League, although remarkably there have been 3 occasions where last place, the only team which is certain to drop out of the top flight every year, has finished some 18 points away from survival, namely in 2009-10, 2013-14 and 2021-22. To separate ties, the team who will feature is the one who picked up the fewest points across the campaign, meaning that Lausanne Sport narrowly come out in last place behind Auru, who got 24 points in 2009-10, and, well, Lausanne Sport, with 23 points in 2013-14. The club are owned by Jim Ratcliffe, Britain's richest person, and were also the worst team on FIFA 07. 2 things which, obviously, are inextricably linked to one another, but they have been a bit of a yo-yo club over the last decade or so, tasting 4 promotions and suffering 3 relegations since 2010-11. The most recent of those relegations came in 2021-22, when they ended up on just 22 points and were 18 points away from even entertaining the thought of surviving in the Super League, with 9th place Luzern and 8th place Grasshoppers both tied on 40 points apiece. They won promotion back to the Swiss Super League again in 2022-23, benefiting from the league's expansion to 12 teams as of the 2023-24 campaign, as they came in second behind Yverdon to earn yet another automatic promotion. Österreichische Bundesliga, Vorwärts Steyr and Grazer AK, 28 points. Now we enter a tricky situation in Austria, as we have an exact tie between 2 teams, namely Vorwärts Steyr and Grazer AK. Both of them ended their respective seasons on 6 points and were 28 points away from safety, or at the very least the relegation playoff in Steyr's case, so it makes sense to profile both of them. Vorwärts clearly weren't living up to their name, it means forward in German, as they were only going backwards with debts of 15 million shillings, and it culminated in a quite miserable campaign that saw them fail to register a single win, concede 93 goals in 36 games, and pick up just 6 points. Although they did get back to the Österreichische Bundesliga in 1998-99, they were relegated immediately again with a slightly better tally of 12 points, albeit they were deducted 3 for failing to meet licensing rules, and by 2001, with the club in financial turmoil, they essentially folded and were forced to start out again in the 8th tier of Austrian football. A similar fate befell the other team in question, Grazer AK, as they too would suffer extreme financial hardship during the 2000s and 2010s, which was the catalyst behind their 2006-07 relegation. They were deducted 28 points by the Austrian FA for their financial troubles, and without that, they would have actually finished above Wacker Tirol on goals scored and staved off the threat of relegation. However, the authorities weren't having any of it and sent them down another division to the 3rd tier because of their financial state, and by 2012, despite being under new owners, their plight was so perilous that they, much like Vorwärts, folded and began life again in the 8th tier, although they won 6 successive promotions to get back up to the second tier for the 2019-20 campaign, where they've remained ever since. Scottish Premier League, Gretna, 27 points. I have spoken about Gretna's story on this channel in the past, but it is worth bringing up again because it is quite remarkable. And of course, since they hold the record of being 27 points away from survival in Scotland, they have to feature in this video. Following election to the Scottish Football League system in 2002 and a takeover by wealthy businessman Brooks Malson, they rose up through the leagues at a rapid rate, obtaining 3 successive promotions between 2005 and 2007 and scoring nearly 300 goals across those 3 seasons. What's more, they became the first team from Scotland's third tier to reach the Scottish FA Cup final in 2006, albeit they lost on penalties to Hearts, but it earned them qualification to the UEFA Cup in 2006-07, where they were eliminated in the first round by Irish side Derry City. However, things unravelled quickly, as their stadium was deemed unfit to host Scottish Premier League games, meaning they had to play their home matches, quote-unquote home there, in Motherwell. And in January 2008, Milson, a heavy smoker throughout his life, was taken seriously ill with a brain infection. He immediately withdrew all of his financial support from the club, with staff and players subsequently going unpaid, and their club captain even being made redundant. Unsurprisingly, with the chaos unfurling around them, they were hit with a 10-point deduction for entering administration, and the Scottish FA had to pay the club's staff and players until the end of the campaign, just so they could finish it. It ended with them on 13 points with that deduction applied, 27 behind Kilmarnock in 11th, and with no buyer having been found and everyone at the club being made redundant, they were liquidated entirely in August 2008. Just 3 months on, Milson died aged 61 after suffering a heart attack and falling into a garden pond, and 2 years later, he was posthumously declared bankrupt. A tragic end to a tragic tale. Belgian Pro League, KSV Waregem, 19 points. The third and final tie in this video takes us to Belgium, although there is yet another technicality. I know, I do apologise. In 2008-09, Mons were cut adrift at the foot of the table with just 3 wins and 19 points to their name and a further 19 points away from guaranteed survival. But since 16th place Roeselare won the relegation playoff ahead of 15th place Dender and were only 11 points ahead of Mons when the actual season concluded, I've made an executive decision to disregard that campaign and instead focus on 1995-96. That year, KSV Waregem were absolutely undisputably 19 points from safety, so they can take their rightful place in this video. The season prior, 1994-95, was one of just 2 years over the previous 3 decades which they had spent outside of the top flight, but they may well have wished that they weren't promoted come the end of the 95-96 season. By that stage, they had won a grand total of 4 games out of 34, with 9 other draws taking their final tally to 21 points, a considerable distance away from Sint-Truiden's total of 40. Eventually, following financial difficulties at the turn of the 21st century, the club merged with Zoltse VV to form Zulte Waregem, who play at Waregem's former stadium but were relegated to the second tier last season. Primeira Liga, Penafiel, 24 points. Moving over to Portugal now, we're profiling a dismal season from Penafiel in 2005-06, although it wasn't actually overwhelmingly terrible, but more so consistently bad. By that, I mean that they only lost 4 matches by more than 2 goals all season, the same number as 13th place Academica, and conceded a not too terrible total of 61 goals. But at the end of the day, they could only win 2 games all season and scored 21 times, and lost 23 games. All of which ultimately sealed their fate. They were stranded at the foot of the league, 19 points away from the other 2 relegated teams, namely Rio Ave and Vitória Guimarães, and 24 behind Belenenses, Navel and Académico, all of whom finished on 39 points. Since then, Penafiel have only spent 1 more season in the Primeira Liga, namely in 2014-15, but although they did better than they did in 2005-06, accruing 22 points, they came in last place again and have failed to return since. Ligue 1, Arles-Avignon, 26 points. I was stunned to find out that France had dropped out of UEFA's top 5 in the coefficient rankings, being replaced by the Netherlands, but I guess when PSG is such a dominant team and fail in the Champions League year after year, it is perhaps unsurprising after all. Back on topic, the season in focus for this particular video is the year before PSG were taken over by Qatari Sports Investment, namely 2010-11, which was won by an Eden Hazard and Moussa Sow inspired Lille. At the other end of the table though was Arles-Avignon, who were competing in what would turn out to be their one and only season in Ligue 1. Having only turned professional in 2009 ahead of their first campaign in Ligue 2 for 30 years, they carried on that momentum of winning promotion from the National to Ligue 2 in 2008-09 to finish in third and win a surprise promotion to the top flight, but it would prove to be a bridge too far for the Minnows. They could only muster up 3 wins and 20 points all campaign, and thanks to an extremely tight season, in which there were only 7 points separating relegated Monaco in 18th and 7th place Bordeaux, they ended up a whopping 26 points away from keeping their heads above the water. Things began to unravel from there though, as following 4 years back in Ligue 2, they were relegated in 2015 and then liquidated a few months later owing to perilous financial problems, sending them all the way down to the DHR Méditerranée, the 7th tier of French football, reverting back to amateur status. They're now in tier 6, the DH Méditerranée. Eredivisie, Fortuna Sittard, 20 points. We have another instance where despite a team having a quite frankly abysmal season, this time RBC, who finished their 2005-06 campaign on just 9 points, it wasn't quite abysmal enough in comparison to everyone else to feature in this video. However, that is partly because the teams in 16th and 17th in 2005-06, namely Willems Vee and NEC Breda, both managed to win their relegation playoffs to maintain their Eredivisie status, and if neither of them had, the gap would have been 26 points rather than 19. Setting a record in the process. By contrast, in 2001-02, both Sparta Rotterdam and FC Den Bosch, the teams who took part in the relegation playoffs that year, failed to escape them, meaning that bottom place Fortuna Sittard were technically 20 points away from that guaranteed survival spot held by FC Groningen. Mind you, when you have just 3 wins to your name all year and 23 losses, with 71 goals conceded in the process, you don't really stand much of a chance of survival and perhaps deserve your inclusion in a video like this. Following their disaster class of a season, it took them another 16 years to finally win a promotion back to the Eredivisie, where they have remained ever since, although they were in one of the 2 relegation playoff spots in 2019-20 when the season was voided owing to COVID-19. Bundesliga, Freiburg, 18 points. Nowadays, SC Freiburg are notorious overachievers in the Bundesliga. Spearheaded by long-serving manager Christian Streich, who has been in charge since 2011, they have qualified for the Europa League in each of the last 2 seasons and were very close to making it into the Champions League for the first time in their history last season, albeit they were denied by fellow underdogs Union Berlin. It wasn't always thus though. Between 1997 and 2005, they were relegated from the Bundesliga on 3 separate occasions, failing to capitalise or build upon their 3rd place finish in 1994-95, when they ended up just 3 points behind champions Bayern Munich. The worst of those relegations came in 2004-05, and also arguably one of the worst relegations in German history, when they were 18 points away from Borussia Mönchengladbach in 15th, having picked up just 16 points across the season. 6 of those points came in 2 games against Wolfsburg, but they would only win 1 other game all year, conceding 75 goals in the process, meaning that they were sent back down to the Zweite Bundesliga once more. Following 2 failed attempts to get them back up, manager Volker Finke, who had been in charge for 16 years, the longest managerial tenure in German football history, stepped down from his post, and it would take until 2008-09 for them to return to the Bundesliga again. Serie A, Brescia, 28 points. The inclusion for Serie A takes us all the way back to the very first season in which Italy decided to adopt the system of 3 points for a win, namely in 1994-95, a year before it was made mandatory across the world by FIFA. One of the 4 teams promoted from Serie B the previous year, Brescia, clearly didn't adapt to the new system all that well, as in what can only be described as a truly abject campaign, they could only pick up 2 wins all season long, against the teams who finished 1 and 2 places above them, and who were also relegated with them. They could only score 18 times, with just 4 of them coming away from home, and when the curtain came down on the campaign, they were 28 points away from survival. This was one of 3 relegations they would suffer from Serie A during the 1990s, and quite evidently, it was the worst of them all. Things haven't got much better in the years since for the club, especially in recent times, as not only were they relegated to Serie C in 2022-23 after losing the relegation playoff, but they were also bought by former Leeds owner Massimo Cellino, which honestly might just be a fate worse than death. La Liga, Sporting Gijón, 27 points. This is another one of those instances where the outcome of the relegation playoffs makes it a little bit more difficult to calculate exactly the gap between last place and guaranteed survival, but Sporting Gijon's 1997-98 campaign would still feature in this video, however you spin it. They'd only missed one season of La Liga football since the start of the 1970s, and had even come in second in 1978-79. But during the 1990s, their standards slipped and they ended up being embroiled in multiple relegation battles. They could only escape relegation for so long, but when it finally did come around, it came around in quite a spectacular fashion. From their 38 games, they could only conjure up 2 wins and never rose higher than last place from the 6th match day onwards, losing 29 times, conceding 80 goals and amassing a measly 13 points. They ended up 27 points away from Real Oviedo, who survived the relegation playoffs, 31 behind Compostela, who lost them, and 32 adrift of Tenerife, who were the lowest placed team assured of their survival in La Liga that season. Since then, they've only spent 6 years back in the big time, most recently relegated in 2016-17. And they have finished in 17th place in the Segunda División in both of the last 2 seasons. Premier League, Stoke City, 33 points. Going into doing research for the English segment, I thought for sure it would be Derby County's infamous 2007-08 season that would take the wooden spoon, but in fact, they were only 25 points away from safety. And I say only in this context because it was still 8 points away from the English record. Instead, the final dishonour in this video goes to Stoke City, who endured a campaign so bad that it became known by their supporters as the Holocaust season. The previous year, they had survived by virtue of winning their last 2 games, but as they were £500,000 in debt, many of their senior players had to leave, including their top scorer Paul Maguire, and youngsters who clearly weren't ready for the rough and tumble of 1980s English football had to be fast-tracked into the senior side. The signs weren't promising then, especially when a flu virus wiped through the already depleted squad, meaning that a couple of games had to be postponed owing to a lack of players. Although in spite of this setback, they only lost 3 of their opening 8 games, and it didn't seem as though they were on for quite the catastrophic season that they were about to endure. However, things only got worse from there, as they embarked on a run of 10 consecutive losses, and manager Bill Asprey, who had to combine his role with being a coach and a scout owing to the club's financial troubles meaning that they couldn't employ either of those 2 roles, was told to take a break for a while owing to physical and mental exhaustion. When he returned, the losses kept on coming, and he was eventually dismissed in early April, by which stage the club had already been relegated. His replacement, assistant coach Tony Lacey, whom Asprey had been critical of, somehow did even worse, as they lost all 8 of his games in charge, and in the match against Norwich in late April, just 4,597 fans turned up to watch them. In total, they lost 31 games, scored just 26 goals, conceded 93, and won just 3 games all year. Although strangely, all of them came against teams who finished in the top 8 that year, including Arsenal and Man United. But more personally in the context of this video, they finished a staggering 33 points away from 19th place QPR, who had amassed 50 points, and they were so far marooned at the foot of the league that even second to last place Sunderland was still 23 points ahead of them. Tragically, Chairman Bill Edwards, who had been subject to incessant chanting by the Stoke faithful and had to oversee this nightmare, suffered a heart attack in June 1985, just a month after the fateful season ended, and died at the age of 66. It would take 23 more years for them to return to the top flight. And that just about wraps up today's video, looking at the biggest gap between last place and guaranteed survival in a particular season in each of Europe's top 15 leagues. If you enjoyed this video, of course, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and check out the videos that I did on the biggest and smallest gaps between title winners and second place using the links on screen where my hands are, basically. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.